Going back in time, a brief reflection for today's video, analyzing, when you think of the classic British family car of the 50s, something as typically English as warm beer, grey skies and a Sunday roast, does a car designed under the direct influence of General Motors come to mind? Probably not. And yet, for almost a decade, hundreds of thousands of British families bought, drove, maintained and to a large extent, relied on a car that owed far more to Detroit than to Dagenham. The Vauxhall Wyvern. Named after a creature from British heraldry, a two-legged, winged dragon, it was the very picture of British respectability, modest, sensible, unpretentious. The sort of car a bank clerk or a primary school headmaster might park outside a semi-detached in Bedfordshire and feel entirely satisfied with. And yet, under that very British surface, the Wyvern was the product of an American corporate machine that had quietly owned Vauxhall Motors for more than 2 decades before the first Wyvern ever rolled out of the Luton factory. Britain in 1948 was a country pulling itself back together. The war had been over for 3 years, but rationing was still in full effect. Bread had actually been rationed for the very first time in 1946, something that hadn't even happened during the war itself, and meat wouldn't come off the ration until 1946. 54. The government's economic strategy in those years could be summed up in 3 words: export or die. Industry was under intense pressure to ship goods abroad to earn the foreign currency Britain desperately needed, and the motor industry was no exception. It was into this austere, grey, determined Britain that the Vauxhall Wyvern was born. And the story of how it got there and who was really pulling the strings is a good deal more interesting than the car's modest reputation might suggest. Topic 1. The American owner nobody talked about. Let's go back to 1925, because that's where this story really begins. Vauxhall Motors had been building cars in Luton, Bedfordshire, since 1905. In the years before the First World War, the company had earned a genuine sporting reputation. The so-called Prince Henry Vauxhall of 1910 and 1911 was considered among the most capable performance cars in Britain at the time, and the C-Type that followed it was a serious driver's car in an era when most British automobiles were still barely removed from the horse and carriage. But by the early 1920s, the economics had turned against them. Volume car production required investment that Vauxhall simply didn't have, and the sporting niche was too narrow to sustain a growing factory with growing costs. The company was in genuine financial difficulty. In November of 1925, General Motors, already the largest automobile manufacturer in the world, acquired Vauxhall Motors for approximately £2.5 million sterling. To put that in some context, in 1925, that was a very serious sum of money. For General Motors, it was a calculated investment in European expansion at a time when American industrial corporations were beginning to look at overseas markets with serious intent. Ford had already established itself at Dagenham. GM wanted its own European foothold, and Vauxhall provided it. From that moment on, Vauxhall was an American company operating under a British name and flying a British flag. GM didn't advertise this particularly loudly, and there was no great pressure on them to do so. The Luton plant continued to operate. British workers continued to build the cars. The Vauxhall badge with its griffin remained on the bonnet. But the strategic decisions, the investment priorities, and increasingly the design direction came from the United States. Through the 1930s, this arrangement produced some reasonably successful and broadly conventional British family cars. The 10, the 12, the 14, the 12-4, competent enough vehicles that gave relatively little outward indication of their American parentage. But after the war, when it came time to design an entirely new range for a very different Britain, the transatlantic influence became far more visible. General Motors' design culture in the 1940s was shaped above all by one man, Harley Earl, the head of styling who had transformed the visual language of American cars through the 30s and 40s. Earl's studio was pushing American automobiles toward longer, lower, wider profiles, away from the upright, separate-winged pre-war forms, and towards something more sculptural, more aerodynamic in suggestion if not always in practice, more ambitious, in its use of chrome and surface detail. These values filtered directly into Vauxhall's brief for its post-war range. The scale had to be dramatically reduced. The average British buyer of 1948 was operating in a completely different economic universe from his American counterpart, but the philosophical direction was unmistakably American. The result was two new cars, announced together, the Wyvern and the Velox. Two deeply British names, one a heraldic creature, one a Latin word for swift, for two cars shaped at root in Detroit. Topic 2. The E-Type Wyvern, caution before ambition. The first-generation Wyvern, catalogued internally by Vauxhall as the E-Type, arrived in 1948, and it was, by any honest measure, a conservative car. The bodywork was still largely upright and traditional in its proportions. The flowing American curves that would define the second-generation car were present only in early, tentative form. There was a degree of roundness to the front end that separated it from the more angular pre-war Vauxhalls, but this was recognizably a car of the 1940s rather than a preview of what was coming. Compared to what American showrooms were already seeing from GM's domestic brands in the same year, it was cautious, almost to the point of timidity. Under the bonnet sat a four-cylinder engine displacing 1,442 cubic centimeters, producing approximately 35 brake horsepower. This was a modest unit, appropriate for a car positioned as the economical alternative to the six-cylinder Velox, sitting alongside it in the same showroom. The Wyvern was the sensible choice. The Velox was the aspirational one, and in post-war Britain, most people had little choice but to be sensible. Transmission was a 3-speed manual gearbox operated by a column-mounted gear lever, a feature that was, interestingly, far more established practice in the United States than in Britain at the time. The column change was a minor but telling detail, a small piece of American practice transplanted into a British car without most buyers noticing or caring. The market the E-Type Wyvern was entering was not straightforward. In 1948, purchasing a new car in Britain was not a casual transaction. Purchase tax on new vehicles was substantial, used by the government both as a revenue tool and as a mechanism for suppressing domestic consumption in favor of export production. Waiting lists were a reality. Petrol remained rationed until May of 1950. The idea of simply walking into a showroom and driving away in a new car was genuinely beyond the reach of the majority of the population. The Wyvern's direct competitors were cars like the Morris Oxford and the Austin A40, established, trusted British names, backed by manufacturers that buyers perceived as genuinely independent and domestic. Vauxhall's American ownership was not a secret, but it was not prominently discussed, and most buyers neither knew nor particularly cared. What they cared about was reliability, economy, and whether the local garage could fix it when something went wrong. On those terms, the E-Type Wyvern was broadly acceptable, without being exceptional. The four-cylinder engine was not especially refined by the standards of the class. It had a reputation for a certain mechanical roughness at higher revs and a top speed of somewhere in the region of 70 miles per hour. Under favorable conditions was adequate rather than exciting. But it did the job, and it kept doing it, which counted for a great deal in an era when people expected to keep their cars running with their own hands. Production of the E-Type ran from 1948 through to 1951. Through this period, Vauxhall's Luton factory was progressively recovering from the constraints of the immediate post-war years, output increasing as materials became more available and the domestic market slowly found its feet. Topic 3. The L-Type Wyvern, when Detroit came to Luton. If the E-Type Wyvern was cautious, the L-Type, introduced in 1951, was a statement, and the statement was unmistakably American. Look at photographs of the L-Type and you see it at once. The body is lower and wider than its predecessor. The front end carries a broad, prominent chrome grille that British motoring journalists of the period nicknamed the dollar grin, and when you see it, the aptness of the name is immediately obvious. Wraparound detailing, a more assertive bonnet line, a silhouette that whispers quite openly of the Chevrolet showroom rather than the Morris garage. It is, in every visual sense, a miniaturized piece of Detroit, a Chevrolet that had been put in the wash and come out smaller, but with its identity entirely intact. The inspiration was not accidental, and it was not hidden. The 1948 Chevrolet, one of Harley Earl's landmark post-war designs, had established a visual vocabulary that General Motors was rolling out, adapted and scaled, across its various international operations. At Vauxhall, the adaptation was considerable. The car had to be smaller, simpler, cheaper, and appropriate for roads and fuel costs that bore no resemblance to American conditions. But the intent of the styling was clear, and the result was a car that looked startlingly modern by the standards of the British market in 1951. The engine grew modestly for the L-Type to 1,508 cubic centimeters, still a four-cylinder unit, now producing approximately 35 to 40 brake horsepower, depending on the source you consult. Performance was not the point. Nobody was purchasing a Wyvern to drive quickly, and any owner who pretended otherwise was fooling himself. But the engine was adequate for the roads and speeds of the era, and fuel consumption, never a trivial concern in a country that had only just stopped rationing petrol, was reasonable for the class. The three-speed column change remained. Ride quality was generally considered acceptable. The Wyvern was a car that got on with the job in the background, reliably and without theatre, and that was precisely what its market required. What the L-Type introduced that genuinely advanced the car's case was the currency of appearance. Britain in the early 1950s was beginning, cautiously and unevenly, to emerge from the long shadow of the war and its aftermath. Coronation, year 1953, brought a mood of careful national optimism, a sense that things might, slowly, be getting better. Families who had lived through the war, through rationing, through the grim utility years, were beginning to see some improvement in their circumstances. And the idea of a new car, a modern-looking car, one that faced forward rather than backward, was gradually becoming imaginable for a segment of the population for whom it had been completely out of reach before. The Wyvern's American-influenced styling worked powerfully in its favor in this context. It looked progressive. It looked, if you stood back and considered it honestly, a little like something from the films, from those American pictures filling British cinemas in the early 1950s. Full of wide roads and chrome bumpers, and a specific kind of confidence that post-war Britain was still carefully recovering. A family that parked a Wyvern outside their house in 1953 was not buying transport. They were, in a modest way, buying a signal that things were going in the right direction. Original prices for the L-Type Wyvern in the early 1950s were broadly in the range of £500 to £700 for the basic car, though the purchase tax applicable at the time could add very substantially to the effective cost paid at the showroom. To put those numbers in any meaningful perspective, the average weekly industrial wage in Britain in the early 1950s was somewhere in the region of £8 to £10, which means that a new Wyvern represented the better part of a full year's earnings for a working 19-man. This was not a casual purchase, it was a commitment. The competition by the mid-1950s had intensified considerably. Ford had introduced the Consul, their own four-cylinder family saloon, in 1951, also with styling that owed something to American influences. Ford's own design studios being no more immune to transatlantic pressures than Vauxhall's. The standard Vanguard, which had appeared in 1947 with its own pronounced American-influenced body, was also in the market. The field of family saloons with American stylistic DNA was, it turned out, rather crowded in 1950s Britain, which perhaps tells you something about where the real authority in the global motor industry lay in that era. Bodywork corrosion was the Wyvern's most significant long-term weakness in service, and any owner who kept one through the 1960s will confirm this without prompting. The combination of British weather, salt-treated winter roads, and the steel quality available in the early post-war years was not kind to these cars. Wyverns that survived into the 1970s in genuinely roadworthy condition were predominantly the ones that had received consistent, attentive maintenance. The ones that hadn't had largely returned to the earth from which they came. The L-Type ran in production until 1957, when Vauxhall introduced the F-Type Victor, a car that pushed the American styling influences considerably further still, and was openly described in the British press at the time of its launch as resembling a scaled-down American car, which, of course, is precisely what it was. The pattern established by the Wyvern had found its logical next expression. Surviving Wyverns in the current classic market, particularly well-preserved L-type examples in original or faithfully restored specification, represent an honest and accessible entry point for collectors interested. In authentic post-war British family motoring, values remain modest by the broader standards of the classic market, with presentable examples typically trading in the low thousands. Even exceptional, fully documented examples rarely reach the figures commanded by their more glamorous contemporaries, but for someone who wants a genuine, unadorned piece of 1950s British life, and is comfortable with the knowledge that the corporate life behind it was considerably more American than the badge lets on, the Wyvern carries a quiet, unpretentious appeal that suits it rather well. The Vauxhall Wyvern was never going to set the world on fire. It wasn't designed to. It was designed to provide reliable, affordable, reasonably modern-looking personal transport for ordinary British families at a time when ordinary British families were just beginning to believe that owning a car might be a realistic ambition rather than a distant fantasy. In that, it succeeded. Through 9 years of production, across 2 distinct generations, it did what it was asked to do. It carried people to work, to the seaside, to visit parents and grandparents and school friends across the length and breadth of post-war Britain. It was part of the fabric of daily life in a way that flashier, more celebrated cars never were, precisely because it was ordinary, because it was within reach, because it was there. But the real story of the Wyvern, the story that gives it a significance beyond its modest reputation, is what it reveals about the post-war British motor industry and about the complicated relationship between national identity and corporate reality. Here was a car named after a creature from British heraldry, built by British workers in a British factory, sold to British families as a British product, and owned entirely by an American corporation that had been shaping its design philosophy and its financial priorities from Detroit for more than 2 decades. It wasn't a deliberate deception. Nobody at Vauxhall or General Motors was trying to mislead anyone in any malicious sense. The cars genuinely were built in Luton. The engineering genuinely was adapted for British conditions and British roads. But the comfortable assumption that the Wyvern was an independent British product in the way that a Morris or an Austin was always a fiction. A convenient one, a widely accepted one, but a fiction nonetheless. That tension between surface identity and underlying reality is something the Wyvern shared with a good deal of post-war British life, and perhaps that's part of what makes these cars worth remembering properly. For those of you who knew these cars personally, who learned to drive in one, or remember a neighbor or a family member who owned one, or perhaps spent a reluctant Saturday morning under one on a cold driveway, I genuinely welcome your recollections in the comments below. The details that no archive captures, what the column change felt like after 30,000 miles, whether the heater was as inadequate as its reputation, what the car smelled like on a wet November morning. That knowledge lives with you, and it deserves to be kept. If this kind of detailed, honest exploration of the history behind familiar cars is something you value, please do subscribe. There's considerably more ground to cover. And if you found this particular story worth your time, a like helps other people find it, which is always appreciated. Thank you sincerely for watching. These cars carried real lives, and they deserve to be remembered accurately.